ranting and raving like a drunk father who just stepped on a Lego. It's the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to the 64th episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name's Eric, and I'm here with my broadcast partner, Tom. We are a vintage fiction podcast. We discuss old paperback books from the mid-20th century in genres like adventure, spy, mystery, and western. We also have a blog at paperbackwarrior.com with daily reviews and cover shots of all these paperback classics. Let me bring on Tom, who's going to tell us what's happening today.
Thanks, Eric. On today's show, we're going to be discussing the life and work of a Philadelphia crime fiction author named David Goodis, and I'll explain why he is often called the King of the Losers. In the body of the feature, I'm going to give you a bunch of capsule reviews of several of his novels, but my featured review will be an adventure novel called Devil May Care by Wade Miller. What are you reviewing today, Eric?
Well, you know, the last 2 weeks I've been doing the oldies. I had the 1956 book, and then I did a 1948 book, so I thought it would modernize things a little bit today. So this week I'm going to be reviewing Black Beret's #1 Deadly Reunion by a house named Mike McCrae. It came out in 1984. So I'm looking forward to talking about this book and this series.
Okay, that'll please the knuckle draggers who are sick and tired of my old crime fiction, who want to get back to the hairy-chested men's adventure stuff. But before we get into any of that, you've been driving around Florida with your bride looking for book deals, right?
Yeah. I've hit a number of places across Florida recently. And the first spot I wanted to tell you about was in DeLand, Florida, just northeast from Orlando. It's called the Family Bookshop, and many of the books we talk about on the show have come from this quaint little bookstore. It's run by a married couple who are fairly knowledgeable on newer books. They have a good understanding of what they have in vintage stock, too. Their pricing has always been really odd to me, and they have this weird trade credit ratio that takes getting used to. But Tom and I have both frequented this store, and they've maintained a really good ratio of used books in the men's action-adventure genres as well as western and mystery. And you know, I haven't been to this store in about a year, so I was anxious to see what they have now, and they reopened after the pandemic. So I was driving back from Orlando, and I decided to stop in and just see if there was anything new. Tom, they have a new section near the back of the store, and it's called Collector's Corner.
I can't believe you beat me there.
Yeah, you can only imagine how ecstatic I was to see this. And it's in this section, they've got about 6 or 7 stacks of vintage books. Most of them are all sealed in plastic, which always throws up that red alert on pricing. But here's what they had. And all of these were original paperbacks. None of these are reprints. They had Richard Himmel's The Rich and the Damned. You talked about him a few weeks back. Yeah. We talked about Ori Hitt last week, and I was able to buy one of his books. It's called I Prowl by Night. I also got a Gil Brewer book called The Brat. It looks really good. Milton Ozaki's book Chicago Woman, which was written under the name...
Oh, I know. Robert Saber?
You got it.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I hate the pop quizzes.
Yeah, right on the spot there.
All right, good.
Vin Packer's The Thrill Kids. It looks like a juvenile delinquent book. Another guy we talk about quite often, Marvin Albert. I got one of his Nick Corey penned books called The Girl with No Place to Hide. I got an old one from John Dixon Carr called The Mad Hatter Mystery. And I've got Robert Parker's Ticket to Oblivion. This is not, I checked on this, this is not the same as the Spencer author, Robert B. Parker. This is the other Robert Parker.
Believe it or not, both of them are Robert B. Parker.
Are they really?
Yeah, inconveniently.
Gee whiz. That really is confusing.
Yeah. Hard Case Crime reprinted a Robert B. Parker book, and but it was not, it's the other Robert B. Parker, not the Spencer Robert B. Parker.
Yeah, I think it's called Passport to Peril.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, and they reprinted a Richard Powell book that I reviewed on the web or on the website. I got another Richard Powell book. It's called A Shot in the Dark. It looks great. I also got Robert Kyle's The Golden Urge, and I got the famous Asphalt Jungle, written by W.R. Burnett. Of course, this became a famous movie. And then I got I don't know if this is fantasy or science fiction or maybe it's just plain old action. I got The Spanish Cave by Michael Abalone. And I got 2 World War II novels. Let me ask you if you know this author.
Yeah.
Robert Lowry, Lowry.
I could check my bookshelf. It sounds like I may have something by him, but no, I know nothing about him. So for the sake of the podcast, no, I know nothing.
Well, they have really good painted covers, really beautiful painted covers. One's called Casualty, and the other is called This Is My Night. I'm hoping that they're not romantic flings, set in the war, but we'll see.
Could happen.
I also acquired one called Kane's Woman that looks great by a guy named O.G. Benson. I'm not familiar with him.
That one needs a good cover. That one's always had really bad covers, but the book's supposed to be awesome. It was reprinted under a different title that also had Kane in it, but everyone says it's great, so you should definitely read it. You and I will race to the finish to see who gets to that one first, because that's one of the ones I've been meaning to read.
My cover is fantastic.
Oh, really? Oh, I'll show you my cover. It's embarrassing.
Mine's got a woman's butt on it.
Mine does not have a woman's butt on it. If mine did, I would be way more enthusiastic about it.
Right. I don't know. Let me ask you this, Tom.
Yeah.
Do you have any success at antique stores?
Well, in a few weeks, I want to tell the story of that antique store down in Ocala that you and I had luck at. But other than one particular antique store, one particular seller at one particular kind of sub-store in that antique store, no, I generally don't. And it's also clear that they don't really know how to price their books.
Okay. So I'm going to go on a tirade for a second.
Yeah, no, lay it on me.
And listeners, if you own an antique shop, you can either close your ears on this part, or you might take some advice here. So I find antique stores to be just a notch above your average Goodwill store. The hierarchy for me on brick and mortar shops, going from good to bad, it starts with a used bookstore as being the best, followed by a flea market, then a library sale, then a thrift store, then an antique shop, and then Goodwill. So antique shops are really at the bottom. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, Goodwill specifically, I've had no luck at their stores, but I've had good luck at thrift stores, like no-name thrift stores.
Okay. What infuriates me about antique stores is that these owners should know about old paperbacks, and they should at the very least have 1 or 3 books laying around. But they don't. And here's what happens when I walk into the antique store, okay? They ask me what I'm looking for. And I explain old paperback books from the 1940s or the 1940s and 1970s, or maybe some old men's adventure magazines. And in some cases, I might ask them for old westerns or something just so they get the idea. But they almost always take me to some god-awful dark recess in the building where they have a leaning stack of cookbooks. Every antique store I've ever been in has 10 or 20 cookbooks falling over. They collect cookbooks. They love them. Have you ever noticed there's cookbooks, everywhere in the antique store? It's
a weird pathology. I now that you mention it, it's something I totally recognize, and because you do a better job than I do. I go, do you guys have any old books here? And they go, oh yeah. And they walk you back there. It's like 3 letters of a World Book Encyclopedia from 1959 and some cookbooks.
I don't know. I mean, there's only so many ways you can cook broccoli or chicken, but they never have paperbacks. So, and I shouldn't say that. They'll have some beat up hardback of John Grisham or James Patterson. They might have a vintage hardback or of Treasure Island or something like that, but hardly ever will they have what we like to get our hands on. And it's only when the store owner learns that you aren't interested in his cookbooks, or they offer some kind of advice. They normally tell me, and I know you've ran into this, they normally tell me that their uncle or their grandmother died a few years ago and they have a box or 2 of his or her old paperbacks that they need to go through. And the words that I hear all the time, and you've heard it too, I just need to go through them. And it's programmed in the brain of every antique store owner that I know. And it's all I ever hear. Tom, why do you think that these store owners don't value a box of vintage paperbacks in the same way that they value back issues of Life or Time magazine?
That's funny, because they do carry old magazines. I don't know. They probably don't get a lot of people going in looking for them. I think a lot of the difference between an antique store and a Sanford & Son style junk shop is a very thin line, and it's not really clear. Maybe they don't think of books as being antiques, but here's the thing, they sell bookshelves. Why not just put a bunch of old books on the shelves? Yeah. You got the bookshelf there already instead of it just being bare. And so it doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand
it. I just don't get it. So my wife and I are driving across the state to the Gulf over the Labor Day weekend. And like it was meant to be, my wife spots what looks to be an old funeral home, but it's been converted to an antique store. So we pull in, we walk inside, and I'm thinking the whole time how awesome this podcast story is going to be. We walk to the store, walk up to the store employees, and they explain that this large structure was originally built in the 1920s as a funeral home. Tom, it had the coroner's ramp. It had the doors on the side and the back for the bodies to be wheeled in.
That's kind of neat.
Yeah, it was awesome, and it had the smell of incense and some sort of cleaning chemicals, really kind of a gross smell.
Embalming fluid.
Yes. And it was shaping up, man, to be this extraordinary story. I was so jacked up. And all I needed was a paperback book to seal the deal.
Yeah, to sort of anchor the story.
That's
for
all
the
I
listener.
needed.
Yeah.
Apparently, the funeral home was transformed into a church, But for years, it's just been unused, or it simply was just this antique store.
What town is this?
This was in Lake Alfred,
Okay.
right smack dab in the middle. And as you can imagine, there's lots of rooms. There's a large hallway that led off into other rooms that I assume were viewing parlors. And man, I was so jacked up. And my wife, Sarah, gets this really weird feeling sometimes in buildings, and she didn't like the weird vibe she was getting in one room. But it mostly contained thousands and thousands of canning jars and stupid chinaware and crap like that. But after about a half hour of inspecting every room and hallway, looking through hundreds and hundreds of items, they had one small little shelf dedicated to those little children's books, and they had two paperbacks. They had two paperbacks. One was an installment in Edward S. Aaron's assignment series.
When you say children's books, do you mean children's books, or do you mean like these, the one in my hand, like the Big Little books?
Yes, they had like 3 or 4 of those.
Yeah, I mean, Big Little books are a real collector's item to people in the pulp world.
So they had those, but then the other ones that they had were those the children's books that have the little gold spine going down, and a little cursive writing.
Right, yeah.
They had like 100 of those.
Okay.
And they had a I can't think of the name of it now, but Doctari. It was like a TV show.
Okay.
But they had one of those little books that went with that show.
Got it.
I let it sit there, but they had the Edward S. Aaron's assignment book, and they also had a Cool and Lamb book by an attorney named Earl Stanley Gardner. In utter disappointment, I flipped the Cool and Lamb book over just to see what the cost was. It's beat up. It's ratty.
Yeah.
$35.
You're kidding me. They wanted $35 for a Cool and Lamb book?
Yeah.
Those books were all reprinted 1,000 times.
So I dropped it like it was a scalding hot pan, and I left.
Right.
And that's my entire shopping trips right there in the Sunshine State.
Okay, so while you were ranting, the O.G. Benson book you got was called Cain's Woman.
Mm-hmm.
It was reprinted as Cain's Wife, and here is my copy. And look at that cover.
That's terrible.
Isn't that the worst? Yeah, so I don't even know why they bother doing it, but I'm told the book is excellent. So either you or I should read it and review it, and we should definitely post the butt cover.
Some small print right there.
Yeah, it's a tiny little font or typeface.
Typeface.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to give a quick shout out to our friends at Altus Press who've released a great compilation called The Complete Cases of Max Latin by Norbert Davis. Now, Norbert Davis was a pulp author who sold a lot of stories to Black Mask and Dime Detective magazine in the 1940s, and he wrote 5 stories starring a private eye named Max Latin that all appeared in Dime Detective magazine between 1941 and 1943. Anyway, this new compilation has this really interesting and informative introduction by John D. MacDonald, who explains the career of Norbert Davis. Now, there's not enough there to justify an entire feature on the show, but the short version is that Davis sold a lot of stories to the pulps. And then Davis, probably in a hunt for greater respectability, abandons the pulps in 1943 or 1944, and he starts selling humorous stories to more upscale magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. Now, John D. MacDonald goes on and on and on about what an awful career idea this was for Norbert Davis. The slick magazines were very fussy and no fun, and you could be the toast at a fancy cocktail party, but MacDonald makes a very compelling case that writing stories for the pulps should not be treated like some kind of whoredom, as he calls it. So 1949 rolls around, and Norbert Davis sells a story to the Saturday Evening Post in January. He moves from Southern California to Connecticut, probably at the urging of his wife, who was an East Coast girl. So there were marital problems, and he had one or more stories then getting rejected from the slick magazines, and then his literary agent dies, and one account I read said he may have gotten a cancer diagnosis. So 1949 was like this terrible year for Norbert Davis. And so in the morning of July 28, 1949, he runs a garden hose from the exhaust pipe of his car to the bathroom of the house where he was staying, and he kills himself at age 40. And so I'm getting all these gruesome facts from blackmaskmagazine.com. And he said John D. MacDonald attributes his suicide almost completely to Norbert's abandonment of the pulps to start writing for the slick magazines, which seems a little callous and an oversimplification to me. Anyway, people have not forgotten about Norbert Davis's work for the pulps, and interestingly, no one gives a darn about his pithy stories from the Saturday Evening Post. They all want to know about his pulp work. He had a bunch of stories about an investigator with a dog sidekick called the Doan and Carstairs series, which has also been reprinted as by Altus Press. So the one I got anyway is the Complete Cases of Max Latin, and it's got this awesome hard-boiled cover art. And like everything Altus touches, it's really just a beautiful product. This Max Latin character is a private detective, and the stories are just really straight-up mysteries with hard-boiled scenes, but a lot of madcap humor sprinkled between them. I read the story Watch Me Kill You, and while I recognize it's well-written, it wasn't my type of thing. I've spoken about my bias against stories before 1950, and the Max Latin stories, they just weren't edgy enough for me. I think part of my problem with the stories from the Pulp Fiction era is that they rely on too many cartoonish tropes for me. But listen, if you're into pulp magazine mysteries, you're going to love this book. It's called The Complete Cases of Max Latin, and it's available on Amazon or directly from Altus Press. So I don't want to put this book down. It's a good book. It just wasn't my thing.
I think I have more patience with that stuff. I think I've done like Cardigan and The Green Llama.
Yeah, you may like the Max Latin books. It just something about it just was a half a step off. But I'm so steeped in the '50s stuff that it just felt a little primitive to me. Anyway, ready for the feature?
Let's go to the old days of Philadelphia.
All right, play that tune. All right, let's talk about crime fiction author David Goodis. He was born in 1917 in Philadelphia to Russian Jewish parents. His dad owned a textile business, and David went to a good high school. He was student council president. He was on the track team, the swim team. He graduated as valedictorian of his class. All this is important because he writes about people who were not that successful in life. The reason his charmed upbringing matters is because when he becomes an author, he's writing almost exclusively about life in the gutter among the drunks, the homeless, prostitutes, and addicts. He also wrote about those people with a tremendous amount of compassion rather than disdain. These societal losers that he wrote about are his protagonists and his heroes. So it's interesting to me, as I was researching his life, that he had this well-adjusted and even affluent upbringing. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. He went to Temple University in Philadelphia, and he graduated with a degree in journalism in 1938. He lands a job with an advertising agency, and during his free time, he writes his first book called Retreat from Oblivion, published in 1939. It was a very mainstream hardcover novel about tangled love affairs between a group of New Yorkers set against the backdrop of the Spanish Civil War. There is zero chance I'll ever read this book, Eric, but I'm happy that the 22-year-old David Goodis finally became a published author. So 1939 was also the year that Goodis moved to New York City, where he began to write full-time, selling stories to the pulp magazines under both his name and a wide variety of pseudonyms. He sold stories everywhere. He sold stories to Gangland Detective Stories, Battlebirds, Daredevil Aces, Dime Mystery, horror stories, terror tales, and Western tales. They say he wrote about 10,000 words per day, and in 5.5-year period, he produced 5 million words for the pulp magazines. Most of these stories have never been reprinted, so you're going to have to buy the old pulp magazines to read them. By the 1940s, Goodis got his foot in the door as a script writer for radio adventure serials, including Hop Harrigan, Superman, and House of Mystery. In 1946, he sold a novel called Dark Passage that was originally serialized in the Saturday Evening Post and was reprinted later as both a hardcover and paperback. It became a successful and highly regarded movie starring Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall the next year in 1947. I read Dark Passage. It's about a guy wrongfully convicted of killing his wife who escapes from prison, gets a new plastic surgery to create a new face, something we see a lot in Pulp Fiction, and then goes about trying to clear his good name by solving the murder. I didn't like it, actually. I thought it just wasn't as good as his 1950s output that we're going to talk about later. The book, Dark Passage, was not painfully bad, but it didn't feel like a David Goodis novel to me. It felt like a 1946 mystery. A crazy footnote is that when the TV show The Fugitive debuted on ABC television in 1963, Goodis sued ABC for $500,000, saying that they stole the story from Dark Passage. The question at issue is whether Goodis even had standing to sue because he had sold the story to the Saturday Evening Post. The question was, did the author maintain the intellectual property rights? The case stretched on in appeals before the court basically ruled that the author had the right to his own work, and merely selling it to a magazine doesn't put the story into public domain, which is what ABC Television was maintaining. So the case settled for $12,000 to the Goodis estate in 1972. Anyway, so Goodis goes to Hollywood, both literally and figuratively. He had a successful writing career working on scripts, including an adaptation of Raymond Chandler's book, The Lady in the Lake, that never got produced. While in California, his novel Nightfall was published in 1947. It's been reprinted by Starkhouse. Now, you read and reviewed Nightfall, and the reviews there at paperbackwarrior.com. Give us a quick capsule review of your thoughts, Eric.
It was basically a man-on-the-run story. It's about a World War II vet named Vanning who's being pursued by a police detective because Vanning had a suitcase containing $300,000 in stolen cash from a bank robbery. And Vanning, he's not a professional thief. He's a commercial artist. And as the plot unfolds, the reader learns how and why he wound up with this stolen cash. The story toggles back and forth between the cop chasing Vanning and Vanning himself. You want to root for both of them, even though they are inherently at odds with one another. I like the book a lot, and I can definitely recommend it. Again, it's called Nightfall by David Goodis.
Great, thanks. So in 1950, Goodis goes back to Philadelphia, and that's where things really start cooking. He was living with his parents and his brother, who was suffering from schizophrenia. This was a formative year for the author because he began to spend time in seedy bars in Philadelphia's crummy neighborhoods. Now, Goodis wrote a crime novel set in that world called Cassidy's Girl, and it was a hit. It sold over 1 million copies after being published as a paperback original by Fawcett Gold Medal, where a lot of his 1950s output was published. Now, Goodis is a smart cookie, and he found his voice with Cassidy's Girl. What followed was really a string of successful standalone novels, mostly taking place on Philadelphia's Skid Row among the drunks and the losers. Let me go through 2 highlights that I reviewed at paperbackwarrior.com. First, I want to talk about a 1954 novel called Black Friday. This one was originally published actually by Lion Books, but it's been reprinted 1 million times since then. You should have no problem finding a copy. The protagonist is a guy named Hart, who's a Skid Row bum, and he's like freezing to death on the streets of Philadelphia during the winter. He's trying to decide whether to roll a hobo for his overcoat just to survive. And as he's wandering around, he sees a guy bleeding to death on the sidewalk from a gunshot wound. Right as the guy is dying, the guy gives his wallet to Hart, and it's loaded with cash. So this leads to a series of events that ends up bringing Hart into the hideout of a heist crew that includes this violent ex-boxer and a super hot platinum blonde. The question is whether Hart is going to join this heist crew or not. Man, I love, love, love this book. But I got to warn the listeners, it is a dark and violent book. If you can't handle some gruesome violence and dismemberment, you may want to skip this one. But if you are a hairy-chested He-Man like me, Eric, you're going to love this book. Again, it's called Black Friday by David Goodis. Now, when I was in college, I read a book by Goodis called Shoot the Piano Player, and it was a masterpiece. Now, you also read it more recently, and you reviewed it for Paperback Warrior. Tell us what you thought.
Well, the first thing is that it was actually titled Down There, and when it was released in 1956 as a Fawcett Gold Medal paperback. It was adapted into a French film in 1960 called Shoot the Piano Player, and you can find the book under both titles. In this one, a downer of a hero is named Eddie, and he's a piano player, and he's playing in a dive bar on Skid Row in Philly. He's friends with a prostitute living down the hall in this flop house. Eddie's bummer of a life is turned on its ear when his brother turns up unexpectedly with a bunch of stolen loot and the mob's on his tail. We later learned that Eddie the piano player was a World War II veteran who played piano at Carnegie Hall before his life took a dive. I really, really liked Down There. It was definitely depressing at parts, as any rags to riches story should be, but the writing was excellent. And Brian Ritt described Goodis' writing as suicide notes, but I prefer to look at them as literary blues songs. But in any case, it was a great, great crime noir novel. Again, the book is called Down There, or Shoot the Piano Player, by David Goodis.
Great, thanks. And a lot of Goodis' short stories have been reprinted in various compilations and anthologies. I want to recommend 2 short stories by him. One is called Black Pudding by It appeared in Manhunt magazine in 1953. And I think it's also available as a kind of single on Kindle. And another one is an excellent one called The Plunge, and that was originally from Mike Shane Mystery Magazine in 1958. Those are two awesome short stories. So between 1939 and 1967, Goodis authored 18 novels, a bunch of which were adapted into French movies. Now, France fell in love with Goodis way more than America ever did. And so this brings us up to 1967. 49-year-old David Goodis was victimized in a strong-arm robbery attempt in Philadelphia. He resisted the muggers and suffered injuries at their hands. A couple days later, he's shoveling snow in front of his house in Philadelphia, and he collapses when he suffered a stroke. He was rushed to the hospital, and he died shortly thereafter. One theory is that the stroke was somehow triggered by the head injury he sustained during the robbery attempt a few days earlier, but who knows, right? So he's buried at Roosevelt Memorial Park in Philadelphia, and he's an author you should check out, man. If you're into these old crime novels, David Goodis is about as good as they come. So anyway, that's it for David Goodis. I do need to read more of his novels. He's really something special. And so, Eric, anything from you, or should we go on to your review?
Yeah, I agree. He's really a great storyteller, and he really had a knack for characters that were flawed and had kind of fallen from glory, and it's just great stuff. So anyway, moving on to my review. Like I said, it's a more modern one. I'm trying to be a little bit more diverse and try not to be so heavy on crime noir. And I think next week our listeners will be surprised to see both of our review choices. But this week I'm reviewing the 1984 opening installment to the Black Berets series, and it's called Deadly Reunion. The Black Berets was a 13-book paperback series published by Dell between 1984 and 1987. And if you can recall, Dell was doing a lot of similar stuff in the mid-'80s with their post-apocalyptic series Traveler and their vigilante series Hawker. So I've read and reviewed a number of those for the blog. The Black Berets was written by John Preston and Michael McDowell under the house name Mike McRae. Now, both of these authors were openly gay, and they authored a number of well-received gay fiction novels. McDowell, surprisingly, also wrote movie and television scripts, including, of all things, Beetlejuice and The Nightmare Before Christmas. I've read and reviewed a number of team-based combat books, so I was really looking forward to checking out this one. So here's the team. All right, so you've got Beak, like bird beak, B-E-A-K, and he's the team leader. And he's a Native American that's teaching school and living on a large wooded area in Louisiana when the book begins. Cowboy is the team's pilot, and he's also addicted to cocaine. Rosie is the medic, and he's essentially the nice guy on the team. Runt is the explosives guy. And there's Harry, and I guess from what I could take, he's really just a fighter. I don't remember him having a particular specialty. And these members were utilized by the CIA as a special forces squad during the Vietnam War. After the war ended, the group disbanded, and they began living their separate lives for something like 8 years. One guy runs a bar, one works in the hospital. You get the idea. In this series, in the series opener, Beaker receives a call from the team's old boss, who's a guy named Parker. After an 8-year hiatus, he wants to put the band back together again. The reason is that a Black Berets team member that was feared dead in the war, and hence is considered missing in action, has been spotted as a prisoner in a Laos military camp. And he's apparently been there for years under harsh and inhumane conditions. Parker wants the team to retrieve him, but to do so, they must contend with all the hostile forces in Laos, as well as being unofficially there per the U.S. government. Beaker and Cowboy are really skeptical of Parker, and they don't trust him, but reluctantly they agree to form the team again. The book's middle chapters gives readers the background on each member, and it recaps their 8 years of civilian life. I think the authors do a really good job with this part of the story. And, unlike a lot of the 1980s brawny heroes, these team members came across as far more vulnerable to me. And because of that, they are really realistic humans. The team members suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and they have a myriad of personal problems like drug and alcohol abuse. There's financial woes, relationship failures, a lot of stuff that veterans go through. In terms of enjoyment, Deadly Reunion is like a really, really good Fawcett gold medal novel. It's really interesting. The team reunites for a secret mission in hostile territory to recover something. And like those old books, it would be the same thing, but they would be in Germany or they'd be in Russia or North Korea, locations around the World War II and Korea era. Those kind of things in the vintage paperbacks. But there's even an old heist bit thrown into the narrative to really capture that vintage feel. And guys, I really had some doubts about another 1980s team combat series, but I instantly fell in love with these characters and the solid writing. I can't say enough good things about it. The ending was great. It opened up the door for a second part of the story. And I would imagine there's probably like a through story arc that runs through the whole series. I've already purchased the second installment, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. I'll have my review on the blog next month, but in the meantime, our good buddy Paul Bishop, he has each book's synopsis and cover on his blog. You can just go out there and Google the words Paul Bishop, Black Berets, and it'll come up for you. It's a resourceful article that I used in my research for this review, so thanks for that, Paul Bishop. Again, this book is called Deadly Reunion, and it's book 1 of the Black Beret series, and you'll find it under house name Mike McRae. Have you ever read any of those books?
Yeah, I have them, and they always sort of look interesting to me, but there's nothing to distinguish them from the dozens of other team-based war books, and so I had no idea it was that good. So I'm glad to hear it, and I will check it out. I'll probably never check it out because you're going to be reviewing them.
Yes.
But since you're going to die before I will, I'll be able to spend my senior years reading all those books that you reviewed.
Yeah, good chance.
So we're going to switch gears. I'm going to do a review for a book called Devil May Care by Wade Miller. Now, childhood friends Robert Wade and H. Bill Miller were responsible for, I think, probably the most successful collaboration in vintage genre fiction. Together, they wrote around 33 novels under the Wade Miller and Whit Masterson pseudonyms, and they sold 15 million copies of their mystery and adventure paperbacks. Many have said that their finest work is their 8th book, Devil May Care, from 1950. And it was recently reprinted by our friends at Stark House as a double paired with their book Sinner Take All from 1960. So the hero of Devil May Care is a guy named Big-O Venn. He's a 40-something soldier of fortune, and he's kind of past his prime. He's working the speaking circuit for $50 a gig, telling his globe-trotting adventure stories to meeting hall audiences. After a speech in Cleveland, Big-O reconnects with an old friend who's got a business proposition. See, the federal law enforcement had deported a Sicilian mobster named Abalone, who is now living comfortably in Mexico. Now, Big-O is hired to deliver a letter to this mobster that's going to exonerate him and allow Abalone to return to the U.S. legally and resume his racketeering. Now, the letter that Big-O needs to deliver is a signed confession from someone else admitting to the crime that got Abalone deported in the first place. So the gangster is willing to pay $20,000 to get his hands on this letter, and Big-O just needs to deliver the confession to Mexico to earn some easy cash. So Big-O accepts the gig. The action then shifts to Mexico, and the mission turns out to be way more complicated than originally presented. Big-O's point of contact for the exchange, right when he gets there, is murdered. So the mobster who took over Jacalone's U.S. racketeering operation is not excited about the prospect of this possible exoneration and repatriation that will result from Big-O's delivery of this letter. So he's kind of caught in the middle here. But Big-O he's basically stranded in Mexico, caught in the crossfire between these two rival gangsters. Everybody wants this letter that Big-O is carrying. And, the Jackalone has $20,000 for Big-O, and the other guy's got like a bullet with his name on it. So Big-O falls in with this impossibly sexy bar hostess named Ginny, and there's a Mexican torch singer that Big-O wants who also seems to basically run the town. Whether these women are friends or foes is a twisty question as the plot develops. There's also a rival mercenary from Big-O's past who surfaces in the same Mexican town to throw a monkey wrench in Big-O's plans. Devil May Care is a fine novel. It's a bit padded and slow in the middle, I thought. As Big-O hangs around Mexico, kind of becoming involved with relationships when he should actually be trying to make contact with the buyer. But once the climactic ending begins, things get really great really quickly with a lot of very cool plot twists and turns. I'm sure that the listener is going to like Devil May Care quite a bit, and I completely understand why many people say it's the strongest Wade Miller release. So I definitely recommend it. It was actually the 9th novel published by Fawcett Gold Medal. And so the book never really had a second life after multiple gold medal printings through the 1950s. So the Stark House reprint's actually a pretty big deal.
And with that, this episode of Paperback Warrior is coming to a close. Please follow us on Facebook and Twitter to communicate with us and other fans of the show. Don't forget to check out the blog at paperbackwarrior.com for daily reviews of old books. And we'll see you next Monday for the next episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. Bye, everyone.
Be cool.